the Executive Director of the RENSSELAER NEWMAN Foundation. And I'm pleased to welcome you this evening for our inaugural Theological Roundtable presentation. The origin of this project was with our students, who, at the end of last year, surfaced this idea that they wanted to have programming that explored the intersection of the Catholic theological and social justice traditions alongside contemporary social questions and pressing issues. That gave birth to what begins this evening. And earlier last semester, they met as a group to begin to just detail topics, questions, and issues they would like to see explored. And one of them was the issue and the challenge of mass migration, immigration, and the Catholic moral theological tradition. When I heard this, I could think of no one better than Father Bernard Mulcahy. Father Bernard is the priest that I go to when I have a theological question. Father Mulcahy is originally from Staten Island. He's a Dominican priest like I am from the Eastern Province, the province of St. Joseph. He also currently is on the faculty at the Pontifical Seminary Josephinum, the graduate school, where he teaches and works in systematic theology. He has a Master in Divinity and a license in theology from our own Pontifical faculty in Washington, as well as a doctorate in systematic theology from the Catholic University of Australia. Father has one book out, Not All Is Grace, and it's really a pleasure and an honor that he will launch this new series that challenges us to look at, within the context of a higher education community, how we apply a 2,000-year-old tradition to the questions that are of political and social import in our day. So join with me in welcoming here to the center, the Chapel and Cultural Center, and to our inaugural RENSSELAER NEWMAN Theological Roundtable presentation, Father Mulcahy.
Thank you, Father. Thank you. Let me start by saying what theology is, because if you're going to RPI, you are not a theology major. And this might help, because what I want to talk about tonight is not current events of controversy about immigration, either in the United States or Chile or Ireland or Germany or Myanmar, or any place. There are lots of them around the world where the topic of mass migration, in other words, lots of people in a short time, I did. What I want to talk about is the theology that Catholics draw on and are led by, more or less, in our dealings with these issues, or could be, should be, not sure how you want to put that, but how does the church, how does our theological tradition think about immigration? First of all, what is a theological tradition? It's a tradition of thinking rigorously and carefully, closely about things that we know by divine revelation. And if you know anything about theology, you will know that theologians tend to disagree and argue about lots and lots of things. Typically, it takes the church time, sometimes a long time, to figure out the truth of complicated questions or difficult questions. For instance, how many gods are there? One. Is Jesus Christ the Son of God? Yes. Can we say he's God? The answer, just to cut to the chase, is yes. But it took some time to argue about this, and then we arrived at an answer, and not everybody agreed with it. They had additional complications and insights, and, well, what about this, and what about that? Anyway, it took a number of centuries for us to settle on what's the wisest way for us to talk about this. And even then, it's always possible that somebody comes up with a new question or a new insight, and then it'll keep theologians busy arguing, and you can always squeeze an article, if not a book, out of any of these fights. How does this affect normal people? Oh, that's irrelevant. We're just interested in our little academic specialty. No, I'll get to normal people, I hope, later. Tonight's topic comes under the general heading of Catholic social teaching, or sometimes called social justice teaching, which is part of moral theology. That's the department that doesn't study questions like the divinity of Christ, but studies, well, what is it to live a Christian life? How do people progress in holiness? How do we get our lives and our souls shaped like Christ so that we can live in intimacy with God? Moral theology deals with that. And then a whole lot of more technical things like, when are you responsible for your actions? If you sneeze, is that a moral action, or what kind of action is that? Where do your emotions fit into moral responsibility? What about the circumstances? Are there some things that are, not bad in themselves, but are changed by the circumstances or by your motivation? Is there anything wrong with driving a car? No, there's not. What if the circumstances include the fact that you're blind? Okay, that would be a problem, right? A circumstance. Or your intention. What if you're driving Father Jordan's car? What if you go out and hotwire it and drive away, right? Well, what is your intention? If your intention is to sell it at a chop shop, this is, we're going to say, immoral. I don't want to rush to judgment, but that's what we're going to say. But if your intention is to take, there's a woman who's in labor, and you're going to rush her to the hospital, that would be, if that's your intention, right, this could mean that you're not stealing a car, right, but that we should define that act of going and hotwiring a car and driving off a different way, morally. How the police see it, I don't know. That's another question. But moral theologians could come up with systems of thinking about questions about human behavior and what's good and what's evil and what's worthy of a good person and a Christian. Complex challenge? Yes, complex challenge of mass migration. Sometimes, I know you know this, but I want to give you an example from the world of theology of justice. Justice is who owes what to whom, right? Suppose that you befriend Mrs. Van Buren. Mrs. Van Buren is from an old Dutch family here in Albany, and she owns an apple orchard. It's 154 acres, and it generates income from the sale of apples. And she just thinks you are so great that in her will, she leaves you this orchard. So you inherit 154 acres of apple trees and a thriving apple business, and you then operate this business and support your family and put your kids through college and so on for the next 25 years. But then you learn that Mrs. Van Buren, who looked so innocent, stole it, the orchard. She cheated her business partner, make up a name, out of ownership of the orchard. So now you realize that you have stolen property, or half of it is stolen property. And let's suppose you're able to identify the heirs of the business partner that got cheated. Do you owe the partner or the children of the partner anything? Or you're like, nope, it's my orchard now. She stole it, but I got it. You do. Or at least that's what our tradition would say. You do. We've thought about this for a long time because, well, people have had property for a long time, and we inherit traditions of moral and legal reasoning from even before the coming of Christ, right? We draw on Judaism and the law system of ancient Rome, which is probably their greatest contribution to the world, is their legal thinking, and probably Greeks and Babylonians, and I don't know who else, right, in the world a couple of thousand years ago, Christians looked around and said, well, yes, this is a legitimate idea. This is a good insight about the justice of inheritance or the justice of possessing property that you then find out is not yours. What if you knew it wasn't, what's her name? Mrs. Van Buren. What if you knew that she cheated this person out when you first got it? What do you owe in that case? What if you didn't learn for 25 years and you've been making money off this orchard for 25 years? Do you have to repay 25 years worth of income? Or perhaps half of 25 years worth of income? What will you do? Suppose you do the right thing and you give half the property back or a 50% interest in the orchard to the rightful heirs of that half. Great. And you're just starting to feel not so guilty about your stolen orchard again when there's a knock at the door, and it's a representative of the Iroquois who says, this land was stolen by, Mrs. Van Buren is from an old Dutch family. Well, they came here and set up a colony and they just, I'm sorry? Well, yeah. This is just an example. So then you figure out, well, what should I do about this now? Do they need to be compensated, and how much, and who compensates, and what, you could have a whole list of questions. And then after, you settle that, then the Hurons show up because, didn't you know the Iroquois drove the Hurons out of the, so you could have many claims, right? And luckily, moral theology is here to help you. There are people who have thought through learning a lot from different legal systems, right? About what does the just person do, right? You don't want to steal, you don't want to cheat, and the answers to these things are not obvious. Also, different civilizations will have different answers, right? This one understands land ownership this way, this one understands it that way. Many think that after enough time has passed, it becomes impractical, right? Because there are no documentary records, and how would you figure out? And what if you are half Huron? Do you get to keep a quarter of the, is there a mathematical formula? Probably not. After a while, no, there isn't. So this is the kind of thing that moral theologians in the field of justice will ask about. What is the righteous person do, right? Notice that moral theologians don't predict every circumstance that could possibly exist. How could they, right? New things happen to new people in new places and cultures and whatever, right? But they develop principles. And then maybe with time, other people question the way that those have been applied, and there might be adjustments or things like that. And a lot of what the church tells us about the moral life developed that way. And about lots of things, like, let's say, most of section 3 in the Catechism, which is the one about morals, you will find things about which there is a stable consensus. And we're certainly not expecting revisions in, like, the law on murder, for instance, or stealing, or things like that, right? But there might be a question, right? I don't know. Maybe Bitcoin raises some question that hadn't really occurred to people before, and there would be a reasonable ground for asking some new question about it. Could be. So don't fear that any minute now there could be a reversal on murder, and you could pursue a different career, and it would be much more exciting. You could become an international assassin or something. If you're not already, I don't know you. So what comes up with immigration? We are not the first people to deal with human migrations. Historians of these kind of things, they actually estimated what percentage of the human race has typically been relocating? Permanently, not just like seasonally, but permanently moving from one place to another. And they, whoever they are, figure between 3.5% to 4% of the human race has been on the move since prehistoric times. Obviously not the same, let's just call it 4%, right? Different 4%, and it's not like, all right, 4% moves this month and then another 4% moves the following month. That would be high speed, right? But the continuous average, and I don't know whether they're talking about years or decades or centuries, less than centuries, because they say at present in the world, at least according to the United Nations, whatever Bureau for issues of migration, they figure it's 3.6% of people are migrating, and they differentiate. I couldn't explain exactly what these categories are, but maybe you know, or anyway, we could look it up. Between people who are migrating, that's the biggest group they're concerned with, but then also you've got people who are seeking asylum, who can be distinguished from people who are refugees, can be distinguished by more knowledgeable people than I, because I think I looked it up, but I don't remember. And then you have people who are like victims of human trafficking, pulled into prostitution or something. There are people who are neither migrating nor are they asylum seekers. They're in a different category. And there are one or two others. The total globally is around 4%. So even so, if you want to just go with percentage, it sounds like, oh, well, that's not particularly new, so I wouldn't expect there to be a lot of new questions. The thing that's new, or anyway characteristic of the present for much of the world, is speed, right? 4% are moving and will resettle within X number of months or years, and another group, or more numbers of the same group, conceivably, right, would move, so that it's moving at a fast pace over time. It's quick. Also, the other thing, people don't move just anywhere, right? Generally, people move either to a neighboring country that's safer, or they set their eyes on a destination where they see the promise of a better life, right? Not many South Americans are saying, I want to move to Venezuela, or at least they weren't 6 months ago. Maybe things are getting slightly better, but because there are issues. I was surprised to see that Iran is in the top 20 destinations, or at least a few months ago was in the top 20 destinations for human migration. I would not have expected that, but there it is. So if moving, and sometimes moving in large numbers, isn't new, why isn't there, because I'm here to tell you there isn't, a very elaborate Catholic theology, moral theology about migration? I'll suggest some things that such a more developed theology might consider in a little bit. Well, why isn't it already developed? Suppose you're living in the year 400 and you're a Christian. So you're probably somewhere in the Mediterranean world, maybe a little bit north or something. And well, what is the issue of immigration that faces you? It could be that you're living in, let's say, Rome. Well, Rome has a centuries-long way of handling issues of people want to move to Rome. Often it needs people for labor, and it welcomes temporary visitors, let's say merchants maybe, and it welcomes people to put down permanent roots, or anyway, they have a whole set of arrangements, and they have very definite expectations, right? You better learn Greek or Latin, and because sometimes it was, I guess by then they're Latin speaking. Yeah, father studied history, so I check with him on these things. You've got to learn Latin. Also, you can't be weird, you know? If the Romans are dressing a certain way, you sort of have to conform, right? By 400, there's only one legal religion in the Roman Empire, or at least there's the official religion of the empire, and other religions are tolerated but not really approved of. Like you might worship your favorite old Roman god, right? Or you might be Jewish, or you might be a Zoroastrian or something, who knows? But if you really want to fit in and be accepted by the Romans, you will probably feel drawn, pressured even, just for social reasons. This is quite apart from what you come to believe is true. You would feel some pressure to sign up with Christianity. So they have a whole bunch of expectations, and they have ways to punish you if you are too weird, if you are too outside the scope of what the Romans are comfortable with. They didn't need a lot of, they didn't need like a border patrol, they didn't need a system of passports or, you know, a lengthy bunch of paperwork that you have to do, and you have to have a job and you get the Roman equivalent of a green card or thing. No, they didn't have all that stuff, but they did have people coming from other places and wanting to live here, right? Pursue some things in Rome, let's say, different places in the world. Well, there's a certain amount of that in the early Christian period, but they were more aware of larger groups coming in, such as the Vandals and the Visigoths and other difficult German tribes, who in turn were being pushed by other people, the Huns, who were moving from Asia, moving west, and sort of pressuring the... by the way, those German tribes were mostly Christian, although they were Arians. They were not they were heretics. They were not Catholics. But they showed up anyway in large numbers, and they set it with spears. So there was... they didn't, and you wouldn't say, oh, they're migrating. They said, they're invading. They're coming to sack Rome. Or that was sort of minor league sacking, but they did it anyway. Eventually, lots of, you know, some of them stay and they sort of blend in. So if you go to northern Italy, you'll see these very German-looking people in some places, you know, with blonde hair, and you'd say, well, that person doesn't look Italian, but they probably have some of, you know, some of their ancestors came in a not so friendly way to tour Rome, and they took souvenirs in, you know, like in the form of gold and slaves and, you know. So you have a few categories that the early church has to deal with. You have, sometimes you might be confronted by invaders, right? Or a few centuries later, you've got the Islamic expansion, right? Islam spreads rapidly, right? It takes about 60 years, I think, to get out of Arabia and spread all the way across, from your point of view, all the way across North Africa, right? And then they stop across the river, across the Straits of Gibraltar from Spain, and then they hop over and they go up there and stay there until the 15th century, when the Spanish Reconquista happens and they reconquer land that they lost not 1,000 years, but 500 years or so before. So Christians experience invasion, and eventually we'll do some invading of our own, but that's one kind of new people coming. Then you have small groups, or maybe people fleeing famine or war or some natural disaster or something. That's a thing, Who else? Temporary visitors like merchants who come every year or something and sell you drill bits or whatever it is that they're selling, and then they go home. And there are probably a few other categories, right? These different kinds of people, and there are different, let's just say, moral responses, right? Would you let your kids marry all of them? No, probably just the Christians, if you're a Christian. Anyway, you'd have a whole bunch of, which ones have to be watched carefully? Which ones are allowed to own land? You've got traditions about this, not just from Rome. Consider the Jewish world, right? Now, by the time Christianity really spreads and the empire starts to become Christian, the Romans, the pre-Christian Romans, have destroyed the temple in Jerusalem, and the Jewish people are spread out more than they had been before. Well, they've got a well-developed tradition of thinking about who can live where and under what conditions. And there's a big old literature on this. You could spend the rest of your life becoming a specialist, and you probably wouldn't become one of the world's leading specialists because they're probably Jewish, on what is the wise and righteous way to understand this. Now, we couldn't take everything from Judaism because of differences between our religions. For instance, Judaism is not only a religion, but also a people, a nation, right? And they have a promised land. So land is a touchy issue more than it is for Christians, right? Not only a land, but each of the 12 tribes of Israel had designated real estate, or at least 11 of them did. That was where their tribe belonged. So they really cared about people who were not in the tribe coming and under what conditions they could come and how this should be regulated. I looked into it. They had at least 5 categories of foreigners that they were concerned about. And the one that's cited, some sources say 36, some say 46 times, and I didn't read the whole Old Testament to find out. But either 36 or 46 times, the Old Testament says, remember that you were, I'll just say, strangers in the land of Egypt. So don't oppress the foreigner. You have to love the foreigner and treat him as one of your own people. Treat him like another Jew, right? Another person who belongs in the land, even though his parents weren't Jewish, right? Or he's from someplace else. But that's only one category. And that's not any foreigner, at least according to the commentaries I looked at. That's the foreigner who converts to Judaism. So you might be tempted to hassle him and give him a hard time because he's Egyptian or something. But if he's signed up with the covenant, then he belongs in sort of that first most favored group. And then if you have someone who will live righteously without becoming Jewish, without circumcision and joining the whole keeping of the covenant, right? Some other people, if they'll live righteously, they can live in the land. Even though they're not entitled to the land, it wasn't promised by them, but they can live there. And there's a whole set of rules. They have to worship God, the same God as Israel worships, and they can't break a few dietary laws they have to follow, and they have to live chastely, not getting into wild sexual misbehavior, and there's a list of stuff that they've got to do if they want to be allowed to live in the land as non-Jews. And trust me, there are 3 more categories, which I can tell you don't need to know. But it starts to get a bit complex. What about us? You didn't come here to hear about the Romans. Let me just check my time. Okay, cool. In modern Catholic social teaching, most of what is taught most confidently comes from popes. In modern Catholic, the father of modern Catholic social teaching is usually said to be Pope Leo XIII, who was pope from the 1870s? No. Later 1870s up through maybe 1903, 4, something like that. Yeah. Leo XIII, anyways, considered the father of modern Catholic social teaching because he wrote about, tried to address new problems facing the world in the late 1800s, like especially the circumstances of workers with industrialization. Well, didn't religious people care about workers or treating your workers justly before Leo XIII? Isn't there something or other in the gospel, perhaps, that has to do with, or in the Old Testament, right, about treating people justly? If you were going to develop teaching about society, might you want to include the Beatitudes? Yes. That's why we say modern Catholic social teaching, dealing with specifically modern problems. Because of that, because the popes are because one, it's the popes who are mostly doing it. The church, as the world gets smaller in the 1800s, the way that the papacy functions in teaching, I don't mean this in a bad way, as it were, the voice of the Pope gets louder. Catholics can hear him no matter where they are in the world. Well, that was not true in the year 1000, right? You might not even know that, oh, there's a Pope, I didn't know that. Or, I mean, maybe you'd hear his name at Mass or something, but he wasn't, or things that he wasn't of a teaching voice that was being heard as widely as he would become when communication improves. So did the church have anything to say about mass migration in, let's say, the 13th century? Yes, surprisingly enough. My favorite ecumenical council, Lateran IV, which took place within 1 month in the year 1215, they dealt with a lot of things, and they had policies about the populations living in the Latin Christian world. And they had some things to say that we would not want to say about who could live where. Now, they're concerned not with, some Germans moving to Italy or something like that. They're concerned about Jews and Muslims coming to live in Christendom or already living there, right? And they come up with some rules, like, for instance, if you're Jewish or Muslim, you're a member of a very small minority in the Christian world. Well, you have to wear distinctive clothing so that, Christians can beware of your sneaky ways of business or whatever. Or for instance, on Good Friday, you have to stay in your house. You can't go out. Why was that? Was it pure hostility? Is it because, look, we know the Christian people and they will give you a hard time on Good Friday, so for your own good, stay? I don't know exactly how they decided. But you can find decisions, rulings, not much theology. These are sort of practical decisions, and they did not leave much of a record. And because they held a council and it took a month and they did a lot of things, there was not a lot of debate. Yet another thing that you could study. You could go find out who came up with this rule about special clothes. Some places they were already doing it. Also where you could live, right? If you're Jewish, you can't just live anywhere. In Rome, let's say, you can't move in, but you have to live in the ghetto, the designated area within the city. This is true in lots of cities, right? There are these restricted areas. You can live there. Are you a citizen? Not necessarily. In some lands, you might be relatively well treated, but in others, not. Fast forward to Leo XIII in the late 1800s, father of modern Catholic social teaching. The world has changed. The insights of Christians have changed, and the way that popes go about their poping business has changed. Maybe you know that between 756 and 1890, so rather long time, 1870 rather, pretty long time, the popes ruled a big piece of central Italy, between a quarter and a third in different periods. And because they're ruling a country, in addition to being pope, or it goes along with being pope, well, they need all the stuff any other ruler needs. An army, a navy. There was a papal navy until surprisingly late, like into the early 20th century. It's pretty, if you're interested in nerdy church history facts, there's one. You could, they had to make decisions. Well, are we going to allow vaccinations when those are invented at first? Are they going to be in the papal states? Or what about railroads? What about streetlights? What about freedom of the press? Another favorite of mine, a certain pope in the early 1800s, wrote condemning many modern civil rights things, right, as ideas of the French Revolution and attacks on the church. So, for instance, he said that he referred to freedom of the press as an evil never sufficiently denounced. How many of you have denounced freedom of the press today? No matter how often, it's not sufficient. It's not enough. You cannot. So he was against that. But what people mean by freedom of the press and how much they're pushing it will change over time. And to match that, you have developments in how popes and bishops in general, and lots of Catholics, think about or approach different issues. Migration, mass migration, sorry it's taken me this long to get to this, is one of those issues where we see change. It's our friend Pope Leo XIII who writes the first modern papal letter, an encyclical about migration. And it's called, "Oh, How Distressing." You know, they name these letters from the first couple of words. So he wrote, it's on the bibliography there starts with a chronological list of documents by popes and bishops or about popes and bishops, and then there's an alphabetical scholarly bibliography there, a bit of a hodgepodge, but I thought with questions I might want to refer to something, and you might want to impress people at a party by whipping out a bibliography. How distressing, he wrote, is the situation of our poor Italian people who are immigrating to America. They had high hopes, and they found that things were even worse once they got there. And they were being lured away by atheism and Freemasonry and, worst of all, Protestants, and they were being led into lives of immorality and taken advantage of by unscrupulous employers, and they don't even have priests who can speak the Italian language. It's distressing, as he says there. In fact, 40% of Italian immigrants to the United States turned around and went home. So he was right. Many of them were unhappy, right? Did they find a better economic situation? At least a lot of them did. But others, maybe for economic reasons, but also it's just, they felt maybe it just wasn't home. I'm sure some people felt this way, right? You miss your family, you miss your hometown. There are no good bakeries, or whatever, you have. It's a huge adaptation if you've ever lived in another country, right, other than where you grew up, you've experienced this, that it is, I lived in Australia, which is, right, part of the Anglo-sphere, right, English-speaking world, settled by the British. For the most part, I spoke the language. I could pass as an Australian as long as I didn't open my mouth. But still, to live there for 3 years was not entirely easy. So remember this as one of the challenges, right, for anybody migrating. More popes after him talk about the hard circumstances that migrants find themselves in, and they also begin, this doesn't happen till the 1940s, to talk about human rights. This often surprises people, but it's true. The language of human rights was one that the popes were very suspicious, and lots of Catholics were very suspicious about. That way of thinking about individual rights, first of all, we like to think not so much of individuals as of communities, the family, right, as sort of the primary building block, and then, you know, the city, the country, that kind of thing. We're very wary of the possible selfishness of an individual focus on questions of justice. We want to know how this affects groups, especially families. And then some of the things that are claimed as rights we didn't like. Like, do you have a right to worship frogs? It's wrong, in case you have any doubt, it's wrong to worship frogs. Very wrong, very bad, don't do it. Well, if we say that individuals have freedom of religion, what does that mean? Could you have a right to do things that are wrong? That doesn't make sense, right? Or what if you just believe things that are false? A common thing we would say is, well, error has no rights. How could a false set of ideas have a right? That's crazy. It took time for us to come around to accepting additional insights on this, such as error doesn't have rights, but people do, right? So the individual trying to do what seems right, we have to be more tolerant, allowing for certain things. Now, if they want to sacrifice children, to frogs, we would have objections to this, right? But as long as they're not disrupting other people too much, we would tolerate some things that we, are totally against the commandments, or, we're going to say, you're not going to please God by worshiping frogs. But I picked that because I don't think there's any religion that does. Well, what have we come around to saying in the Catholic Church about migration in general, not just mass migration? I've written it down. Not the quotation from Flavor Flav, which I included for another reason. I don't know if I'll get to that. But down here where I quote the Catechism, they talk about let's just say two sets of rights and responsibilities. These always go together in Catholic social teaching. You have rights because you have duties. There are things that you must do. Therefore, that's why you're free to do them. First, they're concentrating not on migration, let's say, within national boundaries, or they're talking here about migration to richer countries. So the more prosperous nations are obliged, to the extent they are able, to welcome the foreigner in search of security and of the means of livelihood which he cannot find in his country of origin. So that's referring to what the country, or including all the people, have a moral obligation to do insofar as they can. Public authorities should see to it that this right is respected and that the dignity of people coming in is honored and they're protected suitably and so on. Second paragraph, political authorities, for the sake of the common good, that's their job, is to be on the lookout for the good of the whole community, may exercise, may make the right to immigrate, can regulate it, right? There can be laws or limits on, right? If you come, let's suppose that you are the great horde of the Mongols and you ride up, well, you take a boat across and then you ride up to the Capitol building in Washington and you announce that you are settling down in Washington, D.C. And everyone says, while this will be an improvement if we can get rid of the politicians and have the great horde move in, nevertheless, we don't approve of or allow immigration this way. You can't just come on horseback and, shoot arrows at us. And so that's called an invasion. So there can be limits, there can be rules, there can be self-defense, blah, blah, blah. And obligations are not only put upon people who have a duty to welcome the stranger in need, but the people doing the moving have obligations, basically to respect and, at least in some ways, fit with the place that they're moving to. Now, this leaves a lot of room for argument. What does it mean to welcome immigrants in need or immigrants looking for better opportunity or whatever, insofar as you are able? This takes some discernment and decision, and we could all be devout, believing Catholics, but not agree about, well, what are we able to do? Even with the last three or four popes, going back to John Paul II, there have been bishops in some countries who have said, thank you, Holy Father, for your letter or words about migration, but in our country, or in this we're worried about this, right? We're worried about non-Christians. This is a big concern in parts of Europe, Muslim immigration, right? So an Irish student that I have says that in Ireland, there's a warm welcome for Polish migrants. They come for jobs and so on. And his explanation was, well, they're Catholic and they drink. So it's a good fit. And then I don't remember what the other country was, but he named some other country and said, well, there's a lot of resentment and wariness, right? And I think we should be slow to say, well, that just proves how sinful and evil the Irish are. I think what it shows, some people it may just be hatred of foreigners or, irrational prejudice or something. Others might have some reason to feel genuinely threatened, right? Their world seems to be changing. They too have rights, right, to some sort of social stability. It's funny, this first got discussed in the 1600s when some Dominicans working in Spain started to talk about whether it was okay to move to another country and live there permanently. This was only a few years after the Crown had managed to expel the Jews and Muslims from Spain. Well, why would they want to argue that it's okay to move someplace else and stay there? Because of settlement in the New World. Not to say that it was purely, self-interest motivating these things, but you have to think that was a factor. So they argued that it was fine, at least for some people, to move to other people's countries and move in and take charge and take a lot of gold out. I don't know if they wrote about that part or if it happened yet. But anyway, you'll find a lot of interesting tidbits and some not edifying in this history. Without dwelling on current events, I want to conclude my talking part with what you'll find on page 2. I won't read the whole thing because it's a bit long. This is something that was said by a woman I know, Dr. Barbara Golder, who was editor of the Lineker Quarterly, which is like the premier bioethics journal for years. She just retired at Christmas or the end of the year. And she says, well, what I would like to, she thinks, and like a lot of Catholics think, that the popes, Pope Francis, Pope Leo, and our bishops are not sympathetic enough to people who feel threatened by mass migration, right? Their interests are at risk, or they feel like they don't recognize their own country. Half of Italians, 50%, say they don't recognize Italy. It's changed too much since when they were kids, specifically by means of immigration. And whatever you think about that, you can't say, well, obviously it's because they're simply diabolical, all of them. At least some dialogue, right? Some discussion, hesitation to condemn or pathologize the person who sees it this way or that way. Barbara, my friend, Dr. Golder, says she would like to hear from our bishops presentations that consider the rights of people in need and the rights of migrants, but also more about, for instance, the right and the duty of the state to not to have unregulated, right? Not to have open borders or that kind of thing. Or I think during the Obama presidency, it's odd. There's been a reaction, and I'm not saying it's bad, there's been a strong reaction against the Trump administration's talk of mass migration and how policies are carried out, and a lot of criticism and objections. But oddly enough, he still hasn't, or the government still hasn't reached the level of detentions and deportations that happened under a previous president, when a bishop I know in Texas was up in arms, but the bishops in general did not have too much to say. The bishops and the Pope are human, right? They look at the circumstances and they make judgments founded in divine revelation, the teachings of Jesus Christ, our tradition, but they don't always 100% agree with each other, and sometimes from pope to pope, perspectives change. You can take the catechism and take it to the bank. If you're prosperous, you must, insofar as you can, welcome people who are in desperate need. And if you're being welcomed by another country, you have to go with some sort of gratitude and respect toward that society. Well, how much gratitude and how much respect? And what if people are mean? Because a lot of people are mean. I guess we're all mean sometimes. There are more questions that are not elaborated, and you will not find a theological literature about them. Questions such as, when is it okay to leave my home country? When is that a righteous choice? Suppose that the top 10% of people in a country, let's say Ghana, right? Ghana has a terrible shortage of doctors and nurses, not because they don't train any, but because those they train then say, thanks, I have a great opportunity to go and work in a wealthy country, and I can provide better for my family, and they really need nurses, so see you, my fellow Ghanaians, right? This is often called brain drain, right? That highly skilled or highly educated people, if you're in a poorer place, You could say, well, what's better for me and my family is to leave. Well, it's not just about you. It's also about the community that you're leaving, right? This is the society or the civilization that gave you everything when you were born. And is there some kind of moral connection that should remain to your native land? Not a lot of theological or moral reflection on that. I suppose most of us would say, well, yeah, there's got to be something, right? What if you have elderly parents who are not moving with you? You're a Christian, you look to the church for some kind of guidance or direction. You're going to get the advice of what the priest thinks, assuming you ask a priest, well, Father, you think it's okay if I move to Switzerland or whatever? He'll advise you one way or another, but the catechism isn't going to tell you. It's not like there's a dogma or anything that will tell you. How do you move? Where do you move? When do you move? Is it okay to send money home? Some countries, I think El Salvador, has something like a quarter of its population living outside the country, and half of its GDP comes in the form of remittances that Salvadorans who live in other places send money back to their family in El Salvador, which is nice, but there are some moral questions here. Is this a good and desirable thing? Does it help the whole community to flourish if half the income from the country is being earned by people who are not living there? I mean, okay, it covers desperate needs, it's better than starving to death, but what happens over time? What's desirable? John Paul II said that ideally nobody would be forced to move anywhere, right? That you would grow up in a culture and it would nourish you and you would give back to it and you would live your life there and then be gathered to your fathers and buried, where your family had been forever. It's an ideal, right? Not to say it's evil to do something else, but this is what he thought was kind of the beginning point. This is why it's often said the first principle of any theology of migration must be that nobody has to move. Nobody can be forced to move from their native country. And then the second one is, but they have a right to leave. And then, well, what about going someplace else? Do you have a right to go any place you want? If I were going to move, I would want to move to Norway. I could tell you why another time. But that doesn't mean the Norwegians have to let me in just because I want to go there, right? I have to have sufficiently good reasons. And if I'm going to insist on, I don't know, they tend to speak English, so speaking English wouldn't be so bad. But if I just did ugly American things all the time, I couldn't expect, like, if I had a big Texas belt buckle and, you have to fit in. If I walked up to strangers and talked to them or sat next to them on the bus, this is terrible as far as Norwegians are concerned. They prefer not to engage. When COVID came, they were like, oh, now we have to stand closer together, 6 feet apart. Different culture. How should they assess, or how should we assess what's possible, or to the extent that you are able to welcome the stranger, right, as an immigrant? What sort of rules should there be about it? Should people get citizenship right away? There are some countries where it takes 20 years. There used to be some countries where it took 3 generations. So your grandparents could migrate, your parents were still considered foreigners, didn't get to vote, but you, the 3rd generation, would be accorded the rights of a native. That's a fairly restricted, right, policy. I have a list. There's a bunch of questions, and more will occur to you the more you think about this and read about this, right? It's sort of like Mrs. Van Buren's stolen apple orchard and whether you owe any of it to the Iroquois and the Hurons and whoever else came before the Hurons, if anyone. How do you figure this out? You look around the world, you have large numbers, in many places a majority of Catholics supporting voting for candidates who are against mass migration, right? Or think there's been too much migration too fast, right? And this, you might think, is surprising, but it was 60% of church-going Catholics in the United States. Well, this caused some bishops to say, what are we doing wrong? Are we not getting it across? Are we not getting our message across, that kind of thing? Well, perhaps they might take Dr. Golder's advice, and because they don't have to solve all problems. They should condemn big evils and so on, right? But if 60% of your mass-going Catholics think there's been too much immigration, let's just assume that that's what they think and why they voted how they voted, they're probably worth talking more too about why they have that, right? It's one thing to issue a teaching letter or to preach from the pulpit, and you got to do that, right? And it's the right thing to do, but there's got to be more communication, because it's too easy to condemn and say, well, why don't you believe the gospel? That's the end of good community life as the church. But similar things in Germany, in Ireland, in France, in Italy, where there's been sometimes Poland, sometimes divisions, even among the bishops of the country. I mean, not just polite differences of opinion, but like clashes, if there are such things, between brothers. There are. So if we want to be credible as Catholics, we need to be, the way to recognize this is supposed to be that they love one another, right? This certainly includes love for the stranger, but it also includes love for, the person who thinks, well, this is too much too fast, or the way we did this, or I'm worried because this group of immigrants wants this practice that's affecting the way our town has lived for generations. Or there was a lawsuit just settled, a woman in Pittsburgh who wore the veil that covers most of your face. She's a Muslim, and she went to get a driver's license. No, she was getting booked by the police for something, and they wanted to take a mugshot or some kind of photographs. I don't know what it was, but they wanted to take photographs, and they wanted her to remove the veil in public, which she did not want to do. And as a matter of religious freedom, she took the state or the city or whoever it was to court, and she won. It helped her case that there was a law that said that they could simply have her do it in a room with only women present. Like uncovering your face before men or in front of the general public is apparently the thing that's more objectionable. But they didn't even offer her that option. They just told her, nope, you have to do it. And it's not easy to have very different cultures, right? Not to say it should never happen or anything like that, but we want to be realistic, right? If the Irish are happy you're living with the Poles, for spirit reasons. I wish I remember who the other group was. Who's the other big group moving to? Doesn't matter. Is it legitimate to change your immigration policy? Can you say, okay, we really want to welcome these people especially, and then what you leave unsaid is instead of those, right? Because this group we think will fit better, or a bunch of reasons. There's more questions. You'll think of more questions. But there is this hole in moral theology. There's a hole in extended, close, critical, rigorous thinking about what to do, right? How do you address these things that are not easy? Obviously, infidelity to the gospel and for the common good, right? It's not always obvious what the Christ-like thing to do is. I thought this all came down to love God and love your neighbor. It does. But exactly how in complex circumstances is tough. And we could do with more, if we had the time and we're not facing sort of crisis situations, it would be nice if the church had more time to think and reflect and listen to the many different voices all across society, but especially among our fellow Catholics, right, about what people see as problems and solutions and so on. It's on you. Complaints, accusations? Oh, sir.
Yeah, so, I know you're Dominican, you're from the Thomistic tradition. How would, the kind of Aristotelian thinking kind of apply to something like this? Because I know, I believe in Aristotle talks about the common good and how you have the universal destination of goods. Obviously in America there's the idea of assimilation, that if you go to another country, you can adopt some of your ideals from other countries, but ultimately you have to fit into the common good. Like, if there's something immoral, if there's something that, let's say, America views about another country that's immoral, you can come to that country, but you have to leave that immoral idea at the door, kind of thing. How does that kind of apply to immigration and kind of weighing immigration?
That's what I think somebody should work on.
You think so?
Some groups of people should work on this and intelligently, charitably, bounce their ideas off each other, right? And it's not like there's one solution that fits every culture on earth. At least I assume there isn't. Right? What should be done? How should it be done? Aristotle didn't talk about this. He was in one of those places where it took 3 generations to become a citizen. And he didn't, as far as I know, he didn't question that. He just, that's how it is. That's the law. And you can think of reasons why it might make sense. Well, you haven't really put down roots, you're not invested, your grandfather, or you just moved here, maybe you're not quite one of us yet, but it takes a couple of generations. I'm not advocating that, that's just what he was used to. And you could think of reasons why people might like that. But I don't have anything else on that. Yes, sir.
With countries like Poland that have basically no immigration, the country's very Christian, and compared to America, where we have religious freedoms and Islam, and a more lax immigration policy, where if you work hard and like kind of assimilate a little bit, the country's going to accept you. How do you think like the average person here can apply this framework to how do you think we can take it into practice?
For voting, you have to guess if your candidate wins, what are they going to do? Not only about one issue, but like across the board, right? And then I tend to think that you pick the one that's less bad, or should you vote for a third party, right? The American Solidarity Party. Somebody I used to work with was a candidate for the presidency last time around, Peter Sunski. Anybody vote Sunski? But he was the American Solidarity Party, and the Solidarity Party is a group of mainly Christians who are tired of the usual partisan politics. They never expect to win any elections, but they hope to grow their party enough so that maybe one of the major parties leans in their direction to get their votes. Some people think it's good to support and push that kind of thing. Others will, sort of hold their nose and say, well, they're all terrible, but how do you apply the issues on immigration? I guess you try to look, what are the range of issues you're going to vote on, and you try to figure out which of them are most urgent and important. But believers and good people and our bishops vote different ways, right? Some bishops have said, well, I don't see how any good Catholic can vote for, but they don't say the same name or the same party, right? Because their prudential judgment about circumstances is different, even though hopefully the same gospel is. If you want to know what to do practically, I would say listen to the Pope, listen to your bishop. Their perspective on events is not perfect, right? But there are pastors, right? So we should, as a minimum, hear with respect what they're saying and try to understand it, right? Now you might think, well, they're misinformed, or they're not taking this into consideration, or whatever. These are not matters of strict orthodoxy or heresy or something. And the deeper you get into the complexity, the more complex it is. Poland is one of those countries where the bishops are divided. Some bishops side with the ruling party, which is very resistant to immigration, especially by Muslims, because they say, well, we're a Christian society, or we want to be, and therefore we are the common good of the Polish people is threatened by this. But then other bishops, and I think the majority, say, yeah, but look, here we have very poor people who are Christ coming in the guise of people in desperation, and do we just slam the door? Poland has been super welcoming to Ukrainians, I understand, and has made a lot of, well, but there's a cultural closeness there, so they're more comfortable with that. I don't know, are you Polish? No. Okay. What do you think? Your choice.
I think that in America we have the means to help. We have a history of immigration, but it's also
Yeah. Yeah. How do you do it? How fast? What do you do with people who are here now illegally or without documentation? Like, do you go door to door? Your papers, please, and probably not. Sir?
It's almost like this is the first time that there's any kind of borders.
I don't, as far as I know, that's, you might find that like with The Economist, the journal, or some people argue for total open borders, just let people go wherever, and it's sort of like trusting the invisible hand in economics, that it'll all work out and people will go here or there. It kind of ignores culture, language. Are people just parts of an economic machine? How does this affect families? How does, if all the labor we want comes here, what happens to wages? If the supply of labor goes way up, I think generally the price of labor, in other words, the salaries of workers, will go down, right? Which means that what families live on could go, there are, I'm sure, other factors. I'm not an economist, right? But you'd have to take that into account, right? What does this do to other people? I think of that as a more sort of libertarian, pretty hard, like Austrian School of Economics approach. Just let the invisible hand sort it all out. And no, I think it would be modern economies. I mean, if you're a giant company, you know, multinational, whatever, and you want to hire people at the cheapest, the best people cheaply, you don't want things like what country they live in to jam up your business. And right, it's a complication, right? There's a whole class of visas, H-1B visas, that people argue about, right? Because we have lots of people to come work in the tech industry, and is that whatever, Microsoft or Apple, whoever, are they taking advantage by paying less? And how does that affect, I don't know. Are there poor tech workers? If they're unemployed, they are, but I think some of these big companies might not be doing it because of their sympathy for people in desperate need of work. You know, they're doing it because it's good for their business. So they're not looking to apply theological principles or thinking about the common good, either of one society or the universal common good.
And studying a little bit, I mean, we're in the NEWMAN Center right now. I've been studying a little bit about, I've been starting to dig a little bit into St. John Henry Newman and doctrinal development. And I think one of the, correct me if I'm wrong, one of the prerequisites for doctrinal development that he talks about, obviously there's got to be preservation of type, but then he also, I think one of the things he talks about is culture, in the sense that the way some idea, some moral issue, or some doctrine is understood relates to culture of a specific area.
Yeah, the
like,
time and
example,
place. Yeah.
The death penalty. Like today, the Catholic Church in the Catechism says the death penalty is inadmissible. There was a time when the Catholic Church was much more sympathetic to the death penalty, but obviously because of part of what I think influenced Pope St. John Paul II was the prison system, the fact that you can hold someone now in prison for the rest of their lives, whereas that wasn't, you didn't really have the resources to do that as much in older times. So could that model, in regards to immigration, could that be kind of brought in a local level to different countries? Like, oh, this country, culturally or economically, isn't really in a position where it can take a ton of immigrants, but this one is. Is there a way to kind of apply that locally? Or that
There's no other way to apply it.
Yeah.
Right? So Poland, Ireland, Germany, France, the United States, England, even though they don't have well, there are more Catholics going to Mass in England now than Anglicans, but those other countries have lots and lots of Catholics, and the bishops in some of those have had a real difficulty. I mean, in Germany, one bishop, a bishop of Magdeburg, told diocesan employees that they must not support the Alternative for Germany party, which is very, very restrictive in what it wants to do. Now, 25% of the country supports this party. It's become the second biggest, and how many of the supporters are Catholic? Do they have any legitimate point, or are they simply evil? I don't know. But you can only, try to apply these things locally, I think, unless, theologians, after many years of argument, start to come up with some principles that might apply across a long time. One topic that's kind of interesting, speaking of popes and not the death penalty so much, but I mentioned that the popes had their own country for like 1,000 years. Well, of course they had policies on who could live there and who could live where and who could come in from other places. And I mean, they had everything. They had not just a navy, they had special police who would go around and detect dangerous people, like if you were in favor of overthrowing the papal government, right? This is what you have to do. Times are, you can't, well, maybe you can, but in that time and place, we can at least understand why popes and lots of other people would say, yeah, we don't want these crazy revolutionaries coming. And but it's an interesting question too. How did this affect what popes say about social teaching? Because I think when you are king of a country, because it was a strict monarchy, you have to make a lot of those practical decisions, right? It's not an accident that it's after that modern Catholic social teaching begins to emerge, when the popes can have a more, at least ideally, a more detached, right, spiritual view without having, without being one of the players in the territorial political game. There are no more alliances with popes. All right.
As you were speaking tonight, Father, I kept thinking of a classic Dominican principle that we were always taught, which is seldom affirm, never deny, always distinguish. But I think more to the point, what you reminded us today is our national conversation all too often is dominated by voices that seek overly simplistic applications of this sort of sloganization of the gospel, not because they're in service of the gospel, but rather because they're in service of certain political ideologies, for which they try to yoke in religious believers. I think in reminding us this evening about the complexity of these issues and the fact that there really isn't any answer because the Church's theological tradition has not yet come to it, you remind us that we need to be aware and on our guard against the way in which groups, demographics in our national conversation weaponize religion. I think the other thing that you remind us of by pointing out the complexity of questions that have no answer at this moment is a guard against those who want to overly simplify what the Church teaches. And to remember that, as you pointed out at dinner this evening, the Church's doctrines and dogmas create the lines on the field. And it's within that theologians and believers reflect on, discuss, debate, and pray about what this all means. And that this recognition that theology is an ongoing transhistorical dialogue that always has to respond to emergent situations. The context of today is not the context of Leo XIII, and certainly not the context of Leo I. And so I appreciate very much. Yeah. And yeah, exactly. But you remind us that if we just think that there's these pat answers, and we want to take theological position and somehow raise them up to the level of sort of doctrinal status, that we're doing a disservice not only to the gospel, but also how the Church works. The Church thinks through her theologians, but this thinking takes place within a real historical context. It is contingent and takes place in time. Thank you for reminding us that there are questions for which there aren't answers yet, and that the Church will continue in its own sort of engagement with contemporary culture, as well as its discussion and dialogue, its debate, its prayer, in its engagement with the Scriptures, with its understanding of the person of Jesus, to look at how we will continue to come to a better informed response to the circumstances that we face. Thank you for raising questions without answers this evening.